He thought that night was the pinnacle of his life, but all it took was one woman appearing with a child in her arms to turn applause into silence and success into a reckoning with the past. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We post new content every day. Now back to the story. The July night in New York City was especially hot, the kind of humid heat that made the air feel thick, even inside air-conditioned rooms. On the 23rd floor of the corporate tower in Midtown Manhattan, the event hall of MedTech Solutions glittered like a showcase of carefully polished achievements. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden light on tables covered in white linen, while impeccably uniformed waiters circulated among the guests with trays of French champagne and canapés crafted by one of the city's most sought-after chefs. Richard Miller adjusted the knot of his Italian silk tie for the third time in 10 minutes, a habit his personal assistant had learned to recognize as a sign of disguised anxiety. At 42, he had built an empire in the medical technology sector that had started as a small hospital equipment company and now dominated a large portion of the North American market. His diagnostic imaging machines were exported to 16 countries, and the company had just broken its annual revenue record. But that wasn't the only thing being celebrated tonight. Beside him, Brooke Vanderbilt smiled with the practiced elegance of someone who had grown up attending events like this since she was a teenager. The daughter of a retired federal judge and a corporate lawyer with a degree from Harvard Law, she represented everything New York high society considered appropriate for a man in Richard's position. The engagement ring she discreetly displayed was worth more than many apartments, but its true value lay in its symbolism, the consolidation of an alliance between two of the most influential families among America's economic elite. The guests were a carefully curated collection of entrepreneurs, renowned doctors, politicians, and opinion makers. There were representatives from the Chamber of Commerce, directors of private hospitals, foreign investors, and journalists specializing in business. Everyone there knew that being at that party meant more than celebrating a personal success. It meant being part of a circle where business and relationships intertwined in a complex dance of power and influence. Richard observed it, all with the satisfaction of someone who had finally arrived where he had always dreamed of being. 20 years ago, when he started the company in the back of a rented garage in Queens, this moment had seemed impossible. The son of an electronics technician and an elementary school teacher, he had worked during the day and studied at night to earn his degree in biomedical engineering. Every achievement had cost enormous sacrifices. Every step up the ladder had required him to transform himself a little more into the person he believed he needed to be to win. The speech he had just given still echoed in his mind. He had spoken about innovation, about the future of American medicine, about social responsibility, and a commitment to excellence. The words came easily after so many years of practice in meetings, interviews, and events. He had become an expert at telling the official version of his story, the narrative of the visionary entrepreneur who never gave up, who turned obstacles into opportunities, who built something bigger than himself. But there was a part of the story he never told, a part he preferred to keep locked away in a dark corner of his memory, like an old photograph that's too painful to look at but can't be thrown away. It was about a time when he was different, younger, more naive, and deeply in love with a woman who had made him believe he could be loved exactly as he was, without having to play a role. Brooke touched his arm gently, bringing him back to the present. She whispered something about needing to greet a senator who had just arrived, and he nodded automatically, letting her guide the political conversation that followed. It was a dynamic that worked well between them. She had a gift for social diplomacy, while he focused on the technical and financial aspects of the business. A marriage based on intellectual compatibility, mutual respect, and shared goals. It wasn't passion, but it was solid, predictable, and socially appropriate. The first sign that something was wrong was the strange behavior of the security guards near the entrance. Richard noticed they seemed flustered, speaking quickly into their earpieces and looking alternately at the door and at him. Then came the low murmur that started near the entrance and spread through the hall like ripples in a pond. Conversations were cut short, glasses hung suspended in mid-air, and heads turned toward whatever was causing the disturbance. When Richard finally managed to see through the small crowd that had formed, he felt as if someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. There she was, standing at the entrance of the hall with a posture he recognized immediately, back straight, chin slightly raised, that unique mix of vulnerability and determination that had always defined her. Maria Davis. After 5 years of not seeing her, not speaking to her, with no news of her life, there she was, thinner than he remembered, her hair a little shorter, wearing a simple blue dress that contrasted dramatically with the opulence around her. But it wasn't just Maria who had appeared. Beside her, holding her hand tightly, was a boy of about 4. Dark, curly hair, big, curious eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the strange environment. And even from 60 feet away, even with the initial shock clouding his ability to think clearly, Richard recognized something in that child's face that made his world completely fall apart. The boy had his eyes, the same grey-green color he had inherited from his grandfather, the same slightly almond shape, the same focused expression he himself made when trying to understand something complex. But there was more. The way the boy tilted his head to one side when observing something, the shape of his nose, the line of his jaw that was already beginning to define itself. It was like looking at a miniature version of himself. Maria started walking through the hall, and Richard noticed she seemed to be making a conscious effort to keep her breathing steady. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the details, calculating distances, assessing the situation as she always did before making an important decision. It was the same expression she had when she was designing a building, considering every angle, every possibility, every consequence. The people around them began to move away, creating a path for her, but not out of kindness. It was the kind of instinctive retreat that happens when you sense something dramatic is about to unfold. Richard could feel the stares, the hushed whispers, the electric tension that precedes a major social scandal. Brooke squeezed his arm tighter, and he knew she had also understood this was no coincidence. Maria stopped about 10 feet from him. Their eyes met for the first time in 5 years, and it was as if all the noise around them had been muffled by thick glass. For a moment, they were just two people who had once loved each other deeply, hurt each other mutually, and never found a way to say a proper goodbye. Richard saw in her eyes a mixture of old pain, present determination, and something it took him a few seconds to identify. Fear. Fear of being there. Fear of his reaction. Fear of what this moment meant for the child beside her. The boy, sensing the tension in the air without fully understanding it, moved closer to his mother and whispered something in her ear. Maria bent down slightly to answer, never breaking her gaze from Richard's. It was such an intimate gesture, so full of protection and affection, that he felt a pang of something he couldn't name. Envy, longing, regret. It was then that Maria straightened up, took a deep breath, and spoke. Her voice was clear, firm, but it had a quality Richard recognized as the same one she used when she had to defend an architectural project to skeptical clients. It was the voice of someone who had rehearsed what she was going to say, but was also prepared to improvise if necessary. "He's your son, Richard." The words cut through the air like a sharp blade. "And you need to look at him." The impact was immediate and devastating. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut, followed by a sensation of free falling that made his knees tremble. Around them, the silence became absolute. Not even the discreet clinking of waiters clearing glasses could be heard. 200 people had turned into statues, all staring at the drama unfolding in the center of the hall. Brooke let go of his arm as if she'd been burned. Richard saw her out of the corner of his eye, her face pale, her lips parted in shock. She said nothing, but her entire body had pulled away from him, creating a physical distance that perfectly mirrored the emotional chasm that had just opened between them. Richard forced his eyes to focus on the boy. The child looked at him with the natural curiosity of a 4-year-old, not fully understanding why all the adults around him seemed to have stopped breathing. But there was something else in the boy's eyes, something that made Richard's heart pound even harder. Recognition. As if on some instinctive level, he knew this man had something to do with him. What's his name? Richard heard his own voice as if it were coming from far away. Gabriel, Maria answered, and there was pride in the way she said the name. Gabriel Davis Miller. The last name hit Richard like a second blow. She had given the boy his name, even without ever telling him about the pregnancy. Even while raising the child alone, she had kept that connection. It was both a gift and an accusation. Richard took a step closer, then another. The boy didn't back away, just tilted his head to the side in that gesture that was frighteningly familiar. Up close, the resemblances were even more obvious. The shape of his forehead, the curve of his eyebrow, even the way he held his shoulders. It was impossible to deny, impossible to pretend he didn't see it, impossible to go on living as if this moment wasn't happening. Gabriel. Richard repeated the name, and it was surprising how natural it sounded, coming from his mouth. How old are you, Gabriel? 4, the boy answered enthusiastically, holding up 4 little fingers. My birthday was last month. Mommy made a chocolate cake. The simplicity of the answer, the genuine joy in the child's voice, contrasted brutally with the complexity of the situation. Richard realized he had missed 4 birthdays, 4 Christmases, 4 years of a life he could never get back. First words, first steps, first day of school. It had all happened without him. Maria remained motionless, watching the interaction between father and son with an expression Richard couldn't quite decipher. Was there hope there? Anger? Resignation? Probably a bit of everything. She had made the hardest decision of her life by showing up there tonight, interrupting not just a party, but potentially destroying the carefully constructed life he had created. The whispers around them started to become more audible. Richard could catch fragments of scandalized conversations, speculation about what this meant, comments on the timing of the revelation. Some guests had already discreetly headed for the exit, anticipating that this situation was about to become the kind of social scandal that would be talked about for months in New York's elite circles. Brooke finally found her voice. Richard, I have to go. She spoke quietly, but not so quietly that Maria couldn't hear. We'll talk later. He nodded without looking at her, still mesmerized by the presence of the son he never knew existed. Brooke walked away quickly, and Richard knew that was likely the end of another chapter of his life. The engagement, the wedding plans, the stable and predictable life they had built together, it had all disintegrated in a matter of minutes. Gabriel tugged on the hem of his mother's dress. Mommy, can I have one of those little cakes? He pointed to a nearby table filled with elaborate desserts. Maria smiled for the first time since she had entered the hall, and Richard felt his heart clench as he saw how her face transformed when she looked at her son. It was the same smile he remembered, but it had a maturity, a depth that hadn't existed 5 years ago. She had become a mother, had created a life, had single-handedly shouldered the most important responsibility there is. Of course, sweetie, Maria answered, but she looked at Richard as if asking for permission. A small but significant gesture. Richard nodded, still unable to articulate an adequate response to the surreal situation he was in. Gabriel ran to the dessert table with the natural energy of a child, leaving the 2 adults alone in the middle of the hall that now felt more like a battlefield than a celebration. Why now? Richard finally managed to ask. Why did you never tell me? Maria took a deep breath, and Richard saw she had prepared for this question. I tried. Her voice was low but firm. Do you remember the letter I left when I moved out? Richard felt as if a ghost had just materialized in front of him. The letter. He had found it on his desk months after Maria had disappeared from his life. A long letter explaining that she wasn't running from their love, but trying to save her own identity. That she felt erased, diminished, lost in the role of being just the successful entrepreneur's girlfriend. She wrote about needing time, space, a chance to rediscover who she was without him. Yes, I remember, Richard answered, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. You were leaving me. I was saving myself, Maria replied, and there was a firmness in her voice he didn't remember hearing before. And in that letter, Richard, I told you about the pregnancy. I explained everything, but you never got the full version, did you? Richard's world seemed to tilt. What do you mean? Your secretary intercepted the original letter, Maria explained, and Richard could see that truth had cost her a great deal to keep for all these years. She called me later, said you had left instructions not to accept any correspondence from me, that it was for the best that you were trying to move on. The revelation hit Richard like an emotional tsunami. He vaguely remembered giving instructions for his staff to filter unwanted contacts during the tumultuous months after their breakup. It had been a difficult period where he was trying to focus solely on work to keep from going crazy with longing. But he had never imagined that decision could have had such dramatic consequences. Gabriel came running back from the dessert table, his hands and face slightly smeared with chocolate. "Mommy, they're so yummy." He looked at Richard with those all-too-familiar green eyes. "Do you want to try one?" The innocent question momentarily broke the tension between the adults. Richard crouched down to be at the boy's level, and for the first time he could look directly into his son's eyes. There was a light in them, a joy for life that made him think about how different his own childhood had been. Gabriel seemed loved, secure, confident. Maria had done an incredible job raising him alone. "I'd love to try one," Richard answered, and Gabriel ran back to get a treat for him. When they were alone again, Maria spoke in a low voice. "I didn't come here to destroy your life, Richard. I came because Gabriel started asking questions about his father, and because he deserves to know you, even if you don't want to know him." The pain in her voice was evident, and Richard realized Maria hadn't made this decision lightly. She had weighed the consequences, had battled her own uncertainties and fears, had probably spent sleepless nights wondering if she was doing the right thing. Gabriel returned with a small chocolate dessert, offering it to Richard with the kind of natural generosity only children possess. Richard accepted, and when his fingers touched the boy's small ones, he felt a connection he had never experienced before. It was visceral, instinctive, impossible to ignore. "Thank you, Gabriel," Richard said, his voice coming out huskier than he intended. "You're welcome," Gabriel replied, smiling. "Are you Mommy's friend?" The simple question contained layers of complexity Richard didn't know how to navigate. He looked at Maria, searching for some guidance, but saw that she too was struggling to find the right words for a situation that could never be right. We've known each other for a long time," Richard finally answered. Gabriel seemed to accept this explanation with the natural ease of children, but Richard knew that soon there would be harder questions, more complicated conversations, decisions that would affect the rest of their lives. The hall around them had significantly emptied out. Most of the guests had left, likely eager to start spreading the details of the drama they had witnessed. Richard knew that by the next morning, the story would be the talk of every social and business circle in the city. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the 4-year-old boy who carried his genes, his mark, his responsibility. What mattered was the woman who had raised this boy alone, who had made the bravest decision of her life by showing up there tonight. What mattered was finding a way to turn 5 years of loss into something that could, somehow, be repaired. "We need to talk," Richard said finally. "But not here." Maria nodded. "Gabriel's getting tired, and I imagine you have a lot to process." Richard looked around the nearly empty hall, at the remnants of a celebration that had become the landmark of a fundamental shift in his life. When he had woken up that morning, he was an engaged man, a successful entrepreneur with no significant personal complications. Now, a few hours later, he discovered he was a father, that he had lost 5 precious years of his son's life, and that the only woman he had ever truly loved was back in his life under the most dramatic circumstances possible. Gabriel yawned, leaning against his mother's leg. The initial energy of the new environment was fading, and a child's natural exhaustion was setting in. "Mommy, can we go home?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. Maria picked Gabriel up with the ease of someone who had done it thousands of times. "Of course, sweetie." She looked at Richard one last time. "If you want to talk, you know where to find me. My office is still at the same address." Richard nodded, knowing he had to make a decision that would change everything. He watched Maria leave with Gabriel asleep in her arms, and felt as if a fundamental part of himself was walking away again. Alone in the empty hall, surrounded by the remnants of an interrupted celebration, Richard finally understood that his real life was just beginning. 3 days had passed since the night that split Richard Miller's life into 2 distinct parts, before he knew he was a father, and after he discovered he had lost 5 years of his son's life. During that time, he had cancelled all non-essential meetings, ignored the growing pile of messages from journalists wanting a statement on the incident at the party, and spent hours staring out the window of his 28th floor office, trying to process a reality that still felt surreal. Maria's office was in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in a small commercial building that had been renovated to house independent professionals. Richard parked his Mercedes on the narrow street and watched for a few minutes the typical neighborhood scene. Young professionals carrying briefcases, mothers with strollers, local artists setting up small exhibits on the sidewalks. It was a world completely different from the glass-walled corporate environments where he spent most of his time. The name Maria Davis, Architecture and Urban Design, was discreetly engraved on a brass plaque at the building's entrance. Richard walked up the 2 flights of stairs, feeling an anxiety he hadn't experienced since the early years of his company, when every meeting could determine the success or failure of everything he was building. The office door was ajar, and he could hear voices coming from inside. One was Maria's, explaining something about floor plans and city permits. The other was male, young, with a faint southern drawl, the kind you hear from someone who moved up from Atlanta a few years back. Richard hesitated, feeling like an intruder about to interrupt something important. It was Maria who noticed his presence first. She was leaning over a drafting table, her hair tied in a loose bun, wearing a simple white shirt and jeans. Without the tension of the other night, she looked more relaxed, more like the woman he had known years ago. When their eyes met, Richard saw a mix of expectation and caution in them. "Richard," she said simply, straightening up. "Come in, please." The man with her turned, and Richard could instantly assess that he was younger, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of casual good looks that came from a lot of time in the sun and regular exercise. There was something in the way he looked at Maria, then at Richard, that made the entrepreneur immediately realize there was more than just a professional relationship here. "This is Andrew," Maria made the introduction, with a carefully neutral tone. "He's my partner at the studio. Andrew, this is Richard." Andrew extended his hand with the kind of firm grip young professionals use to project confidence, but Richard noticed the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders. It was obvious he knew exactly who Richard was and what his presence there meant. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," Andrew said, and there were layers of meaning in that "finally" that didn't go unnoticed by Richard. A child came running from a room in the back of the office, carrying a small toy truck and making engine noises with his mouth. Gabriel stopped abruptly when he saw Richard, and for a moment the two of them stared at each other with the same mutual curiosity as the other night. "Hi," Gabriel said, with the natural frankness of children. "You're the man from the party." Richard crouched down to the boy's level, feeling that strange sensation again of looking at a miniature version of himself. "Hi, Gabriel. I'm Richard. Can I see your truck?" Gabriel immediately held out the toy, happy to show his treasure to someone new. It was a red fire truck with small movable ladders and lights that blinked when you pressed a button. As Richard examined the toy with genuine interest, he could feel Maria's and Andrew's eyes on them. "This is really cool," Richard commented, handing the truck back. "Do you want to be a firefighter when you grow up?" "Sometimes," Gabriel answered enthusiastically, "but sometimes I want to build buildings like Mommy, or make robots, or take care of sick puppies." The breadth of Gabriel's childhood dreams made Richard smile for the first time in days. There was something liberating about the way children see the future, full of infinite possibilities without the limitations adults learn to accept as inevitable. Andrew quietly addressed Maria. "I'm going to finish up those estimates at home. You'll be okay?" It was a question loaded with genuine concern, and Richard realized there was an almost brotherly protectiveness there. Maria nodded, lightly touching Andrew's arm in a gesture that spoke of intimacy and trust. "Of course. We'll talk tomorrow." After Andrew left, the office grew quieter, with only the sound of Gabriel playing with his trucks in the corner. Maria gestured for Richard to sit in an armchair near the meeting area, herself taking a chair at a carefully calculated distance, close enough to talk, far enough to maintain formality. Coffee, she offered, and Richard accepted more out of a need to have something to do with his hands than a desire for caffeine. While Maria prepared the coffee in a small kitchenette, integrated into the office, Richard observed the space. The walls were covered with architectural plans, models of residential and commercial buildings, and photos of completed projects. There were awards discreetly arranged on a shelf, recognitions for sustainable projects, honorable mentions in architecture competitions. It was clear that Maria had built a solid and respected career. A side table, Richard noticed a series of photographs of Gabriel at different ages. Baby Gabriel in Maria's arms, Gabriel taking his first steps, Gabriel on his first day of school. 5 years of life carefully documented, and he wasn't in a single one of them. "He's a happy kid," Richard commented when Maria returned with the coffee. "He's my everything," Maria replied, and there was as much pride as fierce protection in her voice. "I don't let anything or anyone hurt him." The implicit warning was clear, and Richard took it as such. He was here as a guest, not by right. "Maria, I need you to understand something," Richard began, choosing his words carefully. "When I found out about Gabriel the other night, it was like the world stopped. I didn't know. If I had known—" "What would you have done?" Maria interrupted, and there was a hardness in her voice he wasn't expecting. "Would you have dropped everything? Would you have chosen to be a father over being the tycoon you've become?" The question hit Richard like a punch, because it forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. 5 years ago, when his company was in a crucial expansion phase, when every day meant decisions that could determine the success or failure of everything he had built, would he have really chosen fatherhood? "I don't know," Richard answered with brutal honesty, "but I wish I'd had the chance to find out." Maria studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decipher whether there was real sincerity behind his words, or just the persuasive charm he had perfected over years in business. Gabriel approached them, now carrying a collection of different cars. "Mommy, can I show Richard my cars?" "Of course, sweetie," Maria answered, and Richard noticed how her voice automatically softened when she spoke to her son. Gabriel began to arrange his cars on the floor, creating a small imaginary city complete with roads, garages, and gas stations. He narrated the adventures of each vehicle with the total seriousness of a child completely immersed in his fantasy world. Richard found himself being pulled into the game, crouching on the floor and helping to build the toy city. "This one is the police car," Gabriel explained, showing a small blue and white sedan. "He makes sure everyone drives right." "And this one?" Richard asked, pointing to a tiny red convertible. "That's the daddy's car," Gabriel answered naturally, and the casual comment struck Richard like lightning. Maria immediately tensed. "Gabriel, we've talked about this." "But don't I have a daddy?" Gabriel asked with the relentless logic of children. "All the other kids at school have a mommy and a daddy." Richard felt his heart race. This was exactly the kind of conversation he hadn't prepared for. He looked at Maria, seeking some guidance on how to navigate this minefield. Maria took a deep breath. "Gabriel, Richard, he's your daddy." The simplicity of the statement contrasted dramatically with the complexity of the emotions it unleashed. Gabriel looked at Richard with an expression of pure curiosity, as if processing a new and intriguing piece of information. "You're my daddy?" Gabriel asked Richard directly. "Yes," Richard answered, his voice coming out huskier than he intended. "I'm your daddy." Gabriel considered this information for a few seconds, then smiled. "Cool. Now I can say I have a dad too." The child's pragmatic reaction was both touching and devastating. For Gabriel, having a father was just another normal thing that was finally falling into place in his life. He didn't have the emotional baggage of adults, didn't carry years of hurt and missed opportunities. "Gabriel, why don't you go play at your little table in the back?" Maria suggested. "Daddy and Mommy need to talk about grown-up stuff." Gabriel obediently gathered his cars and went to a small table in the back of the office where there was paper and crayons. Richard was impressed by how easily the boy had accepted the existence of a father who had appeared out of nowhere. "He's incredible," Richard said when they were alone again. "He's the most important thing in my life," Maria replied. "And I won't let him be hurt by empty promises or by someone who's going to show up and disappear whenever it's convenient." The fierce protection in her voice was undeniable, and Richard understood that he would have to prove his intention to be a present father, not just declare it. "What do you want from me, Maria?" Richard asked. "I want to be a part of his life, but I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a dad." "Nobody does," Maria answered, and for a moment her guard lowered slightly. "I learned by doing, by making mistakes, getting it right, trying again. But the difference is I didn't have a choice. From the moment I found out I was pregnant, he became my absolute priority." Richard understood the implicit criticism. Maria was questioning whether he would be capable of making the same choices, the same sacrifices that fatherhood demanded. "I want to learn," Richard said. "I want to try." Maria studied him carefully. "Trying isn't enough, Richard. A child needs consistency. He needs to know he can count on you. Can you guarantee that?" Before Richard could answer, his phone rang. It was Helen, his personal assistant, calling about an urgent meeting with Japanese investors that had been scheduled for that afternoon. Richard looked at the phone, then at Maria, then at Gabriel scribbling intently on a piece of paper in the back of the office. "Answer it," Maria said, and there was a testing tone in her voice. Richard answered the call, but did something that surprised even himself. "Helen, reschedule that meeting. Set it for tomorrow morning." "But, sir, they're only available today," Helen began to protest. "Then schedule it for next week," Richard interrupted. "I'm busy with something more important today." When he hung up, he saw that Maria was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Surprise? Skepticism? Cautious hope? "That was a good start," she said finally. Gabriel came running back with a drawing he had made, a colorful house with 3 stick figures standing outside. "Look what I drew." "It's beautiful, sweetie," Maria praised. "Who are these people?" "This is me, this is you, and this is my daddy." Gabriel pointed to each figure. "We're at our house." The childish drawing represented a simple fantasy, a complete family living together. It was both innocent and complicated, revealing the natural dreams of a child who wanted what he considered normal. Richard felt a tightness in his chest as he realized that Gabriel had automatically included a father in his ideal vision of a family, even without ever having had one present in his life. "It's a very beautiful drawing," Richard said, accepting the paper from Gabriel's small hands. "Can I keep it?" Gabriel nodded enthusiastically, happy to see his artwork being valued. Richard's phone rang again. This time it was Brooke, likely calling for the inevitable conversation about the future of their relationship. Richard looked at the phone, then decided to simply turn it off without answering. "You can't run from everything forever," Maria observed. "I know," Richard replied, "but for today, I want to be here." They spent the rest of the afternoon together, a strange and touching experience for Richard. He watched Gabriel play, helped him with a puzzle, and was even convinced to join an imaginary game where he was a customer buying cars at a dealership run by the 4-year-old. Gabriel had the childlike ability to accept dramatic changes, as if they were completely normal. For him, gaining a father overnight was just another interesting adventure. He asked direct, simple questions. "Do you have a house? Do you like ice cream? Do you know how to drive a truck?" As the afternoon wore on, Richard began to understand the rhythm of Maria's life with Gabriel. There was a structure, a routine she had carefully established. Snack at 3:30, an hour of free play, then quiet time with books or drawing. It was a life organized around the needs of the child, very different from the chaotic, work-centric existence Richard led. When it was time for Gabriel's dinner, Maria prepared a simple meal in the small office kitchen. Richard watched, fascinated. The dynamic between mother and son, the way she cut his food into small pieces, how she negotiated with Gabriel to eat his vegetables, how she herself ate distractedly while making sure he was well fed. "You do this every day?" Richard asked. 3 meals a day plus snacks, Maria answered with a tired smile. 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. The magnitude of the responsibility she had, shouldered alone, hit Richard with full force. While he was building his business empire, Maria was building something infinitely more complex and important. She was raising a human being. When Gabriel started to get sleepy, Maria announced it was time to go home. Richard felt a pang of panic as he realized his first day as a father was coming to an end. Can I see you guys tomorrow?" he asked, hating how uncertain his voice sounded. Maria hesitated. "Richard, Gabriel and I have a routine. He goes to school, I have client meetings, he has swimming lessons. It's not simple to fit someone new into that structure." "I understand," Richard said, though internally he felt frustrated by the complexity of something that should be natural. "But I want to try. I want to learn how to be a part of it." Gabriel, who was half asleep in Maria's lap, lifted his head. "Daddy, are you coming to my school tomorrow?" The innocent question created a moment of tension between the adults. Richard looked at Maria, seeking some guidance. "Maybe not tomorrow, sweetie," Maria answered carefully. "Daddy is learning about our routines." "But I want to show him to Miss Sophia," Gabriel insisted, with the natural persistence of children. Richard felt his heart race as he realized Gabriel wanted to immediately integrate him into every aspect of his life. The child didn't have the emotional complications of adults. For him, having a father simply meant including him in everything. "We'll talk about it tomorrow," Maria said firmly, signaling the end of the discussion. When they left the office, Richard walked them to Maria's car, a used but well-maintained Honda Civic, with a child's car seat in the back and a few toys scattered on the floor. It was a stark contrast to the Mercedes he drove, and another reminder of the fundamental difference between their lives. Gabriel waved from the window as Maria drove away, and Richard stood on the sidewalk watching them disappear into the New York traffic. That night, alone in his luxurious Upper East Side apartment, he looked at the drawing Gabriel had made, 3 stick figures representing a family, and realized that his carefully constructed life had become irrelevant overnight. He had a son, and absolutely no idea how to be the father that child deserved. The front page of the business section of the New York Times featured a photo that made Richard's stomach turn when he saw it over breakfast. It was an image from the night of the party, captured at the exact moment Maria had made her bombshell announcement. The angle of the photo was perfect to capture the shocked expression on Richard's face, Maria's protective stance with Gabriel, and the scandalized faces of the guests in the background. The headline was cruel in its simplicity: "MedTech mogul discovers son during engagement party." The article, written by a journalist specializing in the social lives of New York's elite, speculated on the financial implications of the revelation, discreetly mentioned issues of inheritance and corporate succession, and included statements from sources close to the family that clearly came from Brooke's social circle. Richard threw the newspaper on the table hard enough to knock over his coffee cup. In less than a week, his private life had become public entertainment. His phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from journalists, concerned investors, and curious acquaintances disguised as friends who wanted first-hand details of the scandal. Helen, his assistant, entered the room with an expression he had learned to recognize as a bearer of bad news. "Mr. Miller, Brooke is here. She insists on speaking with you." Before Richard could respond, Brooke walked into the room without waiting for permission. She still wore the impeccable elegance that had always characterized her, but there was a coldness in her eyes he had never seen before. She carried an expensive leather briefcase and moved with the calculated precision of someone who had carefully prepared for this conversation. "Helen, you can leave us alone, please," Brooke said with the natural authority of someone used to giving orders and being obeyed. When they were alone, Brooke sat in the chair across from Richard's desk without being invited and placed the briefcase on her lap with deliberate movements. "5 years, Richard," she began, her voice having the controlled tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. "5 years of a relationship where you never once mentioned you might have a child out there." "I didn't know," Richard replied, feeling like a defendant trying to defend himself. "Didn't know or didn't want to know," Brooke retorted. Because there's a very big difference between those two things, and the people who really matter are going to want to know which one is the truth. Richard stood up and walked to the window, trying to buy time to organize his thoughts. The same old New York stretched out below. Buildings, cars, people rushing to their appointments, but everything looked different now, as if he were looking through a lens that had shifted focus. The truth, Brooke, is that I didn't know, and the truth is also that this changes everything. For you, maybe. Brooke opened the briefcase and took out some documents. But not necessarily for the other people involved in this situation. Richard turned to face her. What do you mean by that? Brooke placed the papers on his desk with meticulous care. They were contracts, articles printed from the internet, and what looked like a report from a private investigation firm. I mean that while you were having your paternal existential crisis, I did my homework, Brooke explained coldly. Maria Davis, architect, graduate of Columbia's Architecture School, specialization in sustainable urbanism, small but well-regarded firm in Williamsburg, annual revenue of approximately $500,000, discreet personal life, no serious public relationships in the last 5 years, a 4-year-old son registered only in her name. The clinical way Brooke recited the details of Maria's life made Richard feel sick. It was as if she were reducing a complex person, a dedicated mother, to a series of financial data and statistics. Why did you have Maria investigated? Richard asked. Because someone needs to think clearly in this situation, Brooke replied, and because I have the right to understand who I was about to marry. She pointed to one of the documents. Did you know she tried to contact you at least 15 times during her pregnancy? Phone calls to your company, emails that were blocked by your spam filter. Even one time she showed up in person at the MedTech building and was prevented from coming up by security. Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Every attempt Maria had made to contact him was more evidence that he had failed as a human being before he even knew he was failing. She really did try to tell me, Richard murmured, more to himself than to Brooke. Of course she did, Brooke agreed with sarcasm. A single woman pregnant with a rich man's child, it's obvious she would try to secure some kind of financial support. The insinuation hit Richard like a slap. It's not about money, Brooke. She never asked for anything. Not yet, Brooke corrected. But now that the situation is public, how long do you think it will be before a lawyer shows up talking about child support, a share of the company's profits, inheritance for the boy? Richard sat down heavily in his chair, feeling the weight of the implications of what Brooke was suggesting. He had spent the last few days thinking only about the emotional aspects of discovering Gabriel, without considering the legal and financial complexities that would inevitably follow. What do you want from me, Brooke? Richard asked, tired. Brooke leaned forward, and for the first time since she had entered the room, her mask of professional coldness slipped slightly. Underneath it, Richard could see the wounded woman she was trying to hide. I want you to tell me if there's still any chance for us, she said, her voice softer now. If you can separate your responsibility as a father from what you feel for her. The question struck at the heart of something Richard had been avoiding examining too closely. Since reuniting with Maria, he had been so focused on Gabriel that he hadn't stopped to analyze his own feelings for the boy's mother. But the inconvenient truth was that being near Maria again had awakened memories and emotions he had carefully buried for years. I don't know, Richard answered honestly. Everything is happening so fast. Brooke studied his face for a long moment. That's not the answer I was expecting from a man who proposed to me 3 months ago. Before Richard could respond, Helen knocked on the door and entered with an urgent expression. Mr. Miller, there's a situation. Maria is downstairs with Gabriel, and there are photographers at the building entrance. Richard stood up immediately. Photographers? At least 5 with professional cameras, Helen explained. It seems someone leaked that she was coming here today. Brooke remained seated, but Richard noticed an almost imperceptible smile cross her lips. He had an uncomfortable suspicion about who might have leaked that information. Have them come up through the side entrance directly to my private elevator, Richard instructed Helen. That won't solve the problem, Brooke observed. They'll continue to be hounded by journalists as long as this story is interesting. And it will be interesting as long as there's mystery and drama. Richard understood the implication. Brooke was suggesting that the only way to end the media circus was with an official statement, a clear definition of status that would reduce the news value of the situation. A few minutes later, Maria and Gabriel entered Richard's office. Gabriel immediately ran to him, carrying a small school backpack and overflowing with childish energy. "Daddy!" Gabriel shouted, and the words still sounded strange and wonderful to Richard's ears. "Look what I made at school." He pulled a crumpled drawing from his backpack, a family of farm animals made with crayons. Richard bent down to examine the artwork, with the seriousness he knew Gabriel expected. Maria greeted Brooke with tense politeness. There was a mutual assessment happening between the two women, each trying to size up the other, to understand exactly what she represented as an obstacle or a threat. "We were followed from the parking lot of my office," Maria explained to Richard. "Gabriel is scared of the cameras." "They make a lot of noise," Gabriel confirmed, moving closer to Richard as if seeking protection. Richard felt a protective anger he had never experienced before. The idea of his son being harassed by paparazzi because of his personal decisions made him want to go out and physically confront every photographer on the sidewalk. "This can't continue," Richard declared. "I completely agree," Brooke joined the conversation. "That's why I suggested you make an official statement. Define the situation clearly and remove the element of mystery that's fueling this frenzy." Maria looked at Brooke with suspicion. "What kind of statement?" "Richard formally acknowledges paternity, establishes a structured visitation agreement, and makes it clear there is no romantic reconciliation between you," Brooke explained with the efficiency of someone who had carefully thought through the strategy. "That turns a scandal into a routine legal matter." Richard realized that Brooke was essentially proposing a deal that would protect her own interests. It would formalize that there was no romantic future between him and Maria, while still allowing him to assume his paternal responsibilities. "And what if I don't want to sign an agreement like that?" Maria asked, a defiant tone in her voice. "Then you'll be condemning your son to a lifetime of being chased by photographers every time you go out together," Brooke replied. "Is that what you want for him?" Gabriel, who was listening to the conversation without fully understanding the context, tugged on the hem of Richard's shirt. "Daddy, why are people taking pictures of us?" Gabriel's innocent question momentarily silenced the three adults. "How do you explain to a 4-year-old that his existence has become public entertainment?" "Because some people are very curious about families that are special like ours," Richard answered, trying to keep his tone light. "We're special?" Gabriel asked with interest. "Very special," Richard confirmed, picking the boy up. Maria watched the interaction between father and son with an expression Richard couldn't quite decipher. There was affection there, but also concern, and something that looked vaguely like jealousy. Richard's phone rang and Helen appeared at the door again. "Mr. Miller, it's Dr. Carvalho from Time magazine. He wants an exclusive interview about your fatherhood." "No," Richard answered, automatically. "No interviews." "Actually," Brooke interrupted, "that might be exactly what you need. A controlled interview where you can tell your version of the story before other people create their own versions." Richard looked at Maria, trying to gauge her reaction to the suggestion. She seemed to be considering the proposal, but there was caution in her eyes. "Gabriel can't be in the interview," Maria said firmly. "Of course not," Brooke agreed. "It would be about the two of you as a former couple and responsible co-parents, civilized, mature, focused on the well-being of the child." Gabriel had grown tired of the adult conversation and had found some toys Richard kept in the office to entertain clients' children. He was on the floor building an elaborate tower with interlocking blocks, completely absorbed in his own creativity. "I need to think," Maria said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make impulsively." "Of course," Richard agreed, "but Maria, Brooke is right about one thing. We can't let Gabriel grow up being chased by photographers." At that moment, Gabriel accidentally knocked over his block tower and began to rebuild it with renewed determination. His natural resilience, his ability to simply start over when something didn't work out, contrasted dramatically with the complexity of the decisions the adults were facing. "Aunt Brooke," Gabriel suddenly addressed Brooke with the natural frankness of children. "Are you my daddy's girlfriend?" The innocent question created a moment of awkward silence among the adults. Brooke looked at Richard, clearly expecting him to answer. "Gabriel, that's complicated," Richard began. "Why is it complicated?" Gabriel insisted. "At school, Clara's daddy is Aunt Rodrigo's boyfriend, and nobody thinks it's complicated." Gabriel's simple logic exposed the unnecessary complexity the adults had created around a situation that, from a child's point of view, was quite straightforward. Maria stood up abruptly. "We should go. Gabriel has his swimming lesson." Gabriel immediately started to protest. "But I want to stay with Daddy." "You can see Daddy another day," Maria said firmly. "When?" Gabriel asked. Maria hesitated, looking at Richard with an expression that pleaded for help. "How about Saturday?" Richard suggested. "We can go to the park." "And the zoo?" Gabriel negotiated with the natural enthusiasm of children. "And the zoo," Richard agreed, smiling. After Maria and Gabriel left, Brooke remained in Richard's office. The silence between them was heavy with all the unsaid things, all the decisions that needed to be made. "You're in love with her," Brooke stated. It wasn't a question. Richard didn't answer immediately, but his lack of an instant denial was answer enough. "I don't want to be," Richard finally admitted. "But you are," Brooke insisted, "and until you resolve that, nothing can move forward. Not our relationship, not your relationship with Gabriel, not anything." Richard knew she was right. Since reuniting with Maria, he had been trying to separate his feelings for her from his responsibility as Gabriel's father. But the truth was, it was impossible to separate the two. Maria and Gabriel were an indivisible package, a family that existed independently of him. "What are you going to do?" Brooke asked. "I don't know," Richard answered honestly. "But I know I can't marry you until I figure this out." Brooke nodded, and Richard saw she had reached the same conclusion. "I'm calling off the wedding," she said simply. "Brooke, No," she interrupted him. "Don't apologize. We both know this was inevitable from the moment she walked into that party." Brooke stood up and organized her papers back into the briefcase. "But Richard, a word of warning. Maria, Davis is smarter than you think. And if you think she showed up at that party by chance, you're being naive." "What do you mean?" "I mean she chose that moment, that place, that way of revealing the secret for a reason," Brooke explained. "And until you figure out what that reason was, you won't really understand who you're dealing with." After Brooke left, Richard was alone in his office, looking out the window at the city that stretched endlessly below him. For 5 years, he had built a life based on control, planning, and rational decisions. Now, in the span of a week, everything had crumbled and rearranged itself around a 4-year-old boy who wanted him to go to the zoo on Saturday. For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't have a plan. And for the first time in a long time, that didn't completely terrify him. 3 weeks had passed since Richard had promised Gabriel they would go to the zoo on Saturday. 3 weeks that had turned into an emotional roller coaster where every small step forward in his relationship with his son was tested by professional crises and external pressures that threatened to swallow any attempt at real change in his priorities. The zoo had been a success. Gabriel had held his hand with natural confidence as they watched the monkeys, had begged to feed the ducks in the pond, and had dozed off on Richard's shoulder during the little train ride through the park. For the first time in his adult life, Richard had spent an entire day without looking at his phone once, completely absorbed in the experience of seeing the world through the curious eyes of a child. But Monday brought a brutal reality check. Lewis Harrison, his majority partner, and CFO, had called an emergency meeting with the company's key investors. The official reason was a discussion on corporate governance and succession issues, but Richard knew the real purpose was to assess whether the CEO's recent personal problems were affecting his leadership abilities. The boardroom on the 30th floor of MedTech Solutions was filled with a group representing over $50 million in investments. There was the representative from the American fund that held 20% of the company, the director of the bank financing their international expansion, and 3 members of the board of directors whom Richard had known since they were classmates in business school. "Richard, We need to address the elephant in the room, Lewis began with his characteristic diplomacy. The last few weeks have been interesting from a corporate image standpoint. Richard remained calm, though internally he felt the familiar mix of anger and anxiety that accompanied any questioning of his authority. My personal life does not interfere with the management of this company. Normally I would agree, interrupted Margaret Sullivan, the representative from the American Fund. But when your personal life makes the front page of the business section 3 times in 2 weeks, it stops being just personal. She slid a few newspaper clippings across the table. Tech mogul calls off wedding after paternity reveal. Med tech solutions. Corporate growth amidst CEO's personal turmoil. Richard Miller and the billion-dollar inheritance. What future for the discovered son? The investors are nervous, Louis explained. Not because of the fatherhood itself, but because of the instability it represents. You've cancelled 17 meetings in the last 3 weeks. You missed the presentation to the Japanese. Your ex-fiancée is spreading interpretations of your current emotional state. Richard felt his jaw tighten. Brooke was clearly using her network of contacts to undermine his professional credibility, a sophisticated form of revenge that hit exactly where he valued his reputation most. My management ability remains intact, Richard declared. The company's results speak for themselves. For now, at least, Margaret agreed. But Richard, we invested in you, not just the company. Your leadership, your focus, your total dedication to corporate growth. If that has changed... She didn't need to finish the sentence. The threat was implicit. If the investors lost confidence in him, they could start pushing for changes in the company's command structure. At that moment, Helen entered the room discreetly and whispered something in Richard's ear. Her expression was tense, worried. "Excuse me," Richard said to the group. "This is urgent." In the hallway, Helen quickly explained. Gabriel's school called. He had a severe asthma attack during gym class. Maria is in a meeting in Stamford and can't get here quickly. They need a family member to pick him up immediately. Richard's world seemed to stop. Gabriel was sick, possibly in danger, and he was here discussing spreadsheets and financial projections. There wasn't even a second of hesitation in his decision. "Cancel the rest of the meeting," Richard instructed Helen. "Sir, but the investors—" "Cancel the meeting," Richard repeated, already heading for the elevator. "Tell them I had a family emergency." When Richard returned to the boardroom to grab his jacket, he could feel the heavy stares of the group. Lewis stood up with a concerned expression. "Richard, where are you going? We're in the middle of a crucial discussion about the future of the company." "My son is sick," Richard answered simply. "He needs me." Margaret Sullivan exchanged a significant look with the other investors. "Richard, do you understand that this is exactly the kind of situation that worries us? You're leaving a $50 million meeting to handle a problem that could be managed by a nanny or a private nurse." The commercial coldness of the comment hit Richard like a slap in the face. For years, he himself had thought the same way. Personal problems were obstacles to be outsourced so they wouldn't interfere with important business. But now, thinking of Gabriel scared and struggling to breathe, that perspective seemed monstrously empty. "You'll have to postpone the meeting," Richard said, leaving the room without looking back. The drive to Gabriel's school was agonizing. The heavy New York traffic, which was normally just an inconvenience, became a physical barrier between him and his son who needed him. Richard found himself whispering prayers he hadn't said since childhood, promising whatever higher power was listening that he would completely change his life if Gabriel would just be okay. The Little B School was in the West Village, in a converted brownstone that maintained the cozy atmosphere of a family home, despite functioning as an educational institution. When Richard arrived, he was greeted by the principal, a middle-aged woman with the kind of professional calm that comes from decades of handling family crises. "Mr. Miller?" she asked, and Richard realized it was the first time anyone from the school had met him as Gabriel's father. "Yes. How is he?" "Much better now. The attack has passed, but we wanted someone to stay with him for the rest of the day, as a precaution," she explained as she led him down hallways decorated with children's drawings. Gabriel got very worried when we couldn't reach Maria right away. He asked if he could call his daddy. The words hit Richard with unexpected emotional force. Gabriel had thought of him when he was scared. He had specifically asked for him. It was the first time Richard felt truly needed as a father. Gabriel was in the nurse's office, sitting on a small bed with colorful sheets, using a small inhaler and looking much smaller than his 4 years. When he saw Richard, his face lit up with a smile that made his father's heart race. "Daddy!" Gabriel exclaimed, holding out his arms for him. Richard went to him and picked him up, feeling how he was still slightly shaky after the scare. "How are you feeling, champ?" "Better now that you're here," Gabriel answered, resting his head on Richard's shoulder with complete trust. The school nurse explained that Gabriel had an exercise-induced asthma attack, something relatively common in children, but that always caused alarm when it happened for the first time at school. She showed Richard how to use the inhaler and explained the warning signs to watch for. "Daddy, can you stay with me today?" Gabriel asked, as Richard carried him to the car. "Of course I can," Richard answered without hesitation. "What do you want to do?" Gabriel thought for a few seconds. "Can we go to your house? I've never seen where you live." The innocent question made Richard realize how little Gabriel knew about his life. The apartment on the Upper East Side was a sophisticated bachelor pad. Designer furniture, modern art, an impeccable kitchen he rarely used. There was nothing there to suggest a child was welcome. But as they drove through the city, Richard realized it didn't matter if the apartment wasn't child-friendly. Gabriel wanted to see his world, wanted to understand how and where his father lived. It was a form of intimacy Richard had never considered. Richard's apartment occupied the entire 15th floor of a luxury residential building. Large windows offered a panoramic view of the city, and the rooms were decorated with the kind of masculine elegance that came from corporate interior design consultants. Gabriel explored everything with the natural curiosity of children. He was fascinated by the 70-inch television in the living room, impressed by the whirlpool tub in the master bedroom, and completely enchanted by the view from the balcony. "Wow, Daddy, you can see everything from here," Gabriel exclaimed, pressed against the window glass. They spent the afternoon together in a way Richard had never imagined. Gabriel found a box of old documents and was fascinated by photos of Richard as a young man, especially one of him at his college graduation, where he was smiling with genuine pride. "Did you look like me when you were little?" Gabriel asked, comparing the photo to his own reflection. "A lot like you," Richard confirmed. "Your mom always said you had my eyes." "Mommy talks about you sometimes," Gabriel revealed with the direct honesty of children. "She gets sad when she talks, but she says you're a good person." The information hit Richard unexpectedly. For all those years, Maria had talked about him to Gabriel. She had kept his memory alive, had prepared the emotional groundwork for an eventual reunion, even with no guarantee it would ever happen. Richard's phone rang several times during the afternoon. Helen calling about missed meetings, Louis wanting to know about continuing the discussions with investors, important clients trying to reschedule appointments. Each time the phone rang, Gabriel looked at him expectantly, waiting to see if his daddy would answer or keep playing. Each time, Richard declined the call. Around 6 in the evening, Maria arrived at the apartment. She was visibly tense from the rush from Stamford, worried about Gabriel, and obviously uncomfortable being in Richard's personal space. "How is he?" were her first words upon entering. "He's great," Richard reassured her. "The attack is completely over." Gabriel ran to his mother and hugged her, immediately starting to recount all the day's adventures. "Mommy, Daddy's apartment is huge, and it has a bathtub that makes bubbles, and we saw the whole city from the window." Maria listened patiently, but Richard could see she was assessing the environment, taking in details, perhaps wondering if this cold, elegant space was suitable for a child. "Maria, I want to talk to you about something," Richard said when Gabriel got distracted with a game on his tablet. They moved to the kitchen, where Richard poured her a coffee and tried to organize the thoughts that had been forming all afternoon. "Today, when the school called, I was in an important meeting," Richard began. "Over $50 million in investments were on the table. People flew in from other countries to be there. Maria watched him carefully, trying to understand where he was going with this. "And I left," Richard continued, "without hesitation, without negotiating, without trying to find an alternative. Because Gabriel needed me." "It was the right thing to do," Maria said simply. "It was," Richard agreed, "but it was the first time in my adult life I've ever done something like that. The first time I chose family over business. And Maria, it was easy. It was the easiest decision I've ever made." He saw that she was processing what this meant, understanding that she was witnessing a fundamental transformation in his priorities. "The investors were not happy," Richard admitted. "They questioned my dedication to the company. My partner thinks I'm losing focus. My ex-fiancée is spreading rumors about my emotional instability." "And does that bother you?" Maria asked. Richard considered the question honestly. "It should. For 15 years, the opinions of those people were the most important thing in my life. But today, when Gabriel called me Daddy in the school nurse's office, nothing else mattered." Maria walked to the window, watching the city light up as night fell. "Richard, you don't have to choose between being a good father and a successful businessman." "But I do have to choose which commitments are negotiable and which aren't," Richard replied. "And today I learned that when it comes to Gabriel, there's no negotiation." At that moment, Gabriel appeared in the kitchen carrying a drawing he had made using some paper he found on Richard's office desk. "Look what I made," he announced proudly. The drawing showed 3 stick figures side by side, clearly representing a family. But this time, instead of the simple house from his previous drawings, the setting was Richard's apartment, with large windows showing the city view. "This is you, Daddy," Gabriel pointed to the middle figure, "and this is me, and this is Mommy. We're at your house looking at New York." Richard looked at the drawing and felt something shift in his chest. Gabriel had included the 3 of them in a family, but now in his world, in the environment Richard had built, it was an evolution in the childish fantasy of a complete family, not just an abstract idea, but a concrete possibility. "It's very beautiful," Maria commented, looking at the drawing over Gabriel's shoulder. "Can I make another one for you to take home, Mummy?" Gabriel offered. "Of course, sweetie." As Gabriel went back to the table to make another drawing, Richard and Maria stood in comfortable silence. Something had changed in the dynamic between them, a tacit acceptance that they were building something new, something neither of them had planned, but that was starting to make sense. "Maria," Richard said after a few minutes, "I want to be a present father, not just on weekends, not just when it's convenient. I want to be there when Gabriel needs me." "I know," Maria replied. "You proved that today." "But I don't know how to balance it with everything else," Richard admitted. "I don't know how to reorganize an entire life that was built around completely different priorities." Maria turned to face him. "Nobody does, Richard. Being a parent is learning by doing, making mistakes, trying again. The difference is that now you want to try." Richard's phone rang again. It was Lewis, probably with more pressure about the missed meetings and postponed decisions. Richard looked at the phone, then at Gabriel focused on his drawing, then at Maria watching him carefully. He turned the phone off without answering. "Tomorrow I'll have to deal with the consequences of today," Richard said. "It's going to be tough." "The best changes always are," Maria replied. As the evening wore on and it was time for Maria and Gabriel to leave, Richard felt a reluctance he had never experienced before. He didn't want this day to end, didn't want to go back to the empty, silent apartment, didn't want to face the next morning full of professional conflicts and external pressures. Gabriel said goodbye with a tight hug. "Daddy, when can I come back here?" "Whenever you want," Richard answered, and realized he was making a promise that would fundamentally change how he organized his time. After they left, Richard was alone in his luxurious apartment, surrounded by all the symbols of his material success. But for the first time, those symbols felt inadequate, incomplete. Something fundamental was missing. Real life was missing. He looked at the drawing Gabriel had made, still on the kitchen table. 3 stick figures representing a possible family, a family that was beginning to take shape in reality. The next day, Richard would have to face angry investors, postponed meetings, and questions about his priorities. He would have to decide if he was willing to completely redefine what success meant in his life. But that night, looking at his son's drawing, he already knew what his answer would be. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Richard Miller was sitting on the living room floor of his new house, building a toy racetrack with Gabriel. It was a Thursday afternoon, and at any other time in his life, he would have been in strategic meetings or analyzing financial reports. But now, on Thursdays, he left the office at 3 o'clock to pick Gabriel up from school and spend the afternoon with him. The house in Park Slope was very different from the apartment on the Upper East Side. Smaller, but with a backyard, 3 bedrooms instead of 1, a functional kitchen where you could actually cook, and a living room designed to be lived in, not just admired. Richard had bought the house 2 months ago, after Gabriel had commented that it would be cool if they could plant flowers together. "Daddy, the blue car is winning!" Gabriel shouted enthusiastically, controlling a small remote control car that had just overtaken Richard's red vehicle. "He's really fast," Richard agreed, genuinely impressed with Gabriel's motor skills. "Where did you learn to drive like that?" "Andrew taught me," Gabriel answered naturally. "He has a car just like this at his house." The mention of Andrew no longer bothered Richard the way it used to. Over the previous months, he had gradually come to understand that the relationship between Maria and her partner was genuinely fraternal, built on years of professional partnership and sincere friendship. Andrew had become an important figure in Gabriel's life, and Richard had learned to see that as a blessing, not a threat. The sound of keys in the lock announced Maria's arrival. She came in carrying grocery bags and with that slightly tired expression of someone who had spent the day navigating between client meetings and the logistics of being a single mother, though technically she wasn't so single anymore. "Hi, my loves," Maria greeted, kissing Gabriel on the forehead and lightly touching Richard's shoulder as she passed. It was a small gesture, but significant of the level of intimacy that had developed between them over the months. "Mommy!" Gabriel ran to her. "I beat Daddy in the race 3 times. "He's destroying me," Richard confirmed with false pride. "I think I need more practice." Maria smiled in that way that always made Richard's heart beat a little faster. "Gabriel, can you go wash your hands? Dinner will be ready in 15 minutes. Gabriel obediently ran to the bathroom, leaving the adults alone in the living room. Maria sat on the floor next to Richard, looking at the elaborate racetrack they had built. "How was your day?" she asked. "Good," Richard answered, starting to put away the toy cars. "The board meeting went better than I expected. They finally stopped questioning my priorities." It had been a long and difficult journey for Richard to regain the trust of his investors and partners. During the first few months after the shift in his priorities, he had faced constant pressure to prove he was still capable of leading the company effectively. There were moments when it seemed he would lose control of MedTech Solutions, especially when Louis had suggested it might be time for Richard to consider hiring an outside CEO. But something interesting had happened. By setting clear boundaries between his personal and professional life, leaving the office at 6 o'clock religiously, reserving weekends for family, refusing long trips during Gabriel's school weeks, Richard had paradoxically become more efficient. He had learned to delegate more, to trust his team, to focus on the truly important decisions instead of trying to micromanage every aspect of the company. The financial results had remained solid. In fact, the company had closed the previous year with 22% growth, driven by 2 new products that had been developed while Richard was spending more time with Gabriel and redefining his life's priorities. "And you?" Richard asked. "How was the meeting with those clients from Chicago?" "We closed the deal," Maria announced with satisfaction. "They want us to do the complete design for the residential complex. It's going to be the studio's biggest project yet." Richard felt a wave of genuine pride in Maria's success. During the months they had spent more time together, he had witnessed firsthand what a talented architect she was, the dedication she put into every project, the way she balanced creativity with financial responsibility. Her studio had grown, hired 2 additional employees, and gained recognition in the trade press. "That's amazing, Maria," Richard said, and there was total sincerity in his voice. "You deserve all this success." Maria watched him carefully. "You really think that, don't you?" It's not just politeness." "Of course I do," Richard replied, surprised by the question. "Why wouldn't I?" "Because 6 months ago, you were engaged to a woman who considered my career a threat," Maria explained. "And because for a long time when we were younger, you had a hard time accepting that other people could have successes independent of your own." The observation hit Richard unexpectedly, forcing him to confront aspects of his personality he had preferred to ignore. It was true that in the past he had struggled to celebrate others' successes when he felt they somehow diminished his own. It was a trait that came from years of intense competition, from believing that life was a zero-sum game where others' success represented his own loss. "I've changed," Richard said simply. "No," Maria confirmed. "It's one of the reasons we're here now." Gabriel came running back from the bathroom, interrupting the moment of intimacy between the adults. "Can I help make dinner?" "Of course, sweetie," Maria answered, getting up. "You can chop the tomatoes." They headed to the kitchen, where Maria began preparing a simple but nutritious meal. Richard observed the dynamic between mother and son, the way they worked together with a naturalness developed over the years. Gabriel had specific tasks: washing vegetables, arranging the flowers he had picked himself from the garden, setting the table. It was a domestic choreography. That spoke of consistency, tradition, and love expressed through everyday actions. "Daddy, do you know how to cook anything?" Gabriel asked, as he carefully arranged the silverware. "I'm learning," Richard admitted. "Your mom is teaching me." It was true. Over the last few months, Maria had patiently taught Richard how to prepare basic meals, explaining that if he wanted to be a present father, he needed to master basic caregiving skills. There was something deeply intimate about these lessons. Maria guiding his hands as he learned to chop an onion, explaining how to season meat, teaching him how to make the pasta with red sauce that Gabriel loved. Dinner was marked by Gabriel's animated conversation about his day at school. He had learned about dinosaurs in science class and was obsessed with the fact that some of them only ate plants. The capacity of children for total enthusiasm for topics that fascinated them never ceased to amaze Richard. "Daddy, did you know there were dinosaurs bigger than your house?" Gabriel asked with wide eyes. "Really? How did they fit anywhere?" "They lived outside," Gabriel explained as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "There were no houses back then." After dinner, they followed the nightly routine that had established itself naturally. Gabriel took a bath while Richard cleaned the kitchen and Maria organized clothes for the next day. Then, the three of them gathered in the living room for an hour of reading before Gabriel went to bed. That night, Gabriel chose a book about astronauts. Richard read the first half, doing different voices for each character, while Gabriel snuggled between him and Maria on the couch. When it was Maria's turn to continue reading, Gabriel was practically asleep but still fighting to keep his eyes open to find out how the space adventure ended. "Time for bed, astronaut," Maria announced when they finished the book. Gabriel protested only for form's sake, more out of principle than any real desire to stay awake. Richard carried him to his room, helped him into his pajamas, and sat on the edge of the bed for the nightly chat that had become a tradition. "Daddy, are you going to keep living here?" Gabriel asked, a question that had come up a few times in recent weeks. Richard had officially moved into the Park Slope house a month ago, but still kept the apartment in Midtown as a secondary office. The transition had been gradual, natural, without any grand declarations or dramatic events. He had simply started spending more nights there, then keeping clothes in the guest room closet, then having mail delivered to the new address. "Where else would I live?" Richard asked back. "I don't know," Gabriel admitted. "But I want you to stay." "I want to stay too," Richard answered honestly. After Gabriel fell asleep, Richard and Maria met in the living room. It was the first real chance they'd had to talk about adult things since Maria had gotten home. They sat on the couch, maintaining a respectful but comfortable distance. "He's starting to assume we're a family," Maria observed. "Have you noticed?" Richard had noticed. In recent weeks, Gabriel had started talking about our house, our garden, our plans, in a way that automatically included all three of them. It was a natural evolution in a child's perspective, but one that carried complex implications for the adults. "How do you feel about that?" Richard asked. Maria considered the question carefully. "Scared," she admitted. "For 5 years, Gabriel and I were a complete unit. We worked well together. We had our routines, our systems. Adding a third person changes everything." "It does," Richard agreed, "but not necessarily for the worse." "No," Maria smiled slightly. "Definitely not for the worse. But it's a big adjustment. For all of us." They sat in silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts. There was something comforting in the ease with which they could now be together, without the constant tension that had marked the first few months of their reunion. "Richard, I need to ask you something," Maria said finally, "and I need an honest answer." "Of course. Are you here because of Gabriel, or because of me?" The question was direct, blunt, the way Maria had always been. Richard took a deep breath, knowing this moment had been inevitable. "Both," he answered. "It started because of Gabriel. The responsibility, the guilt, the desire to be the father he deserves. But Maria, being near you again reminded me of things I had tried to forget." "What things?" "How you made me laugh. How you challenged my ideas without belittling me. How you could be silent with me without it being awkward." Richard paused, searching for the right words. "How I felt whole when I was with you." Maria processed his words carefully. "We're different people now, Richard. I'm not the same woman who would erase herself to support someone else's ego, and you're not the same man who believed love meant possession." "I know," Richard confirmed, "and maybe that's why we can try again, because now we know who we really are." Maria stood up and walked to the window overlooking the small but well-kept garden. In the soft light of the room, Richard could see the changes motherhood had brought to her. There was a new strength in her posture, a confidence that came from having survived life's toughest challenges and emerged victorious. "If we did this," Maria said without turning around, "if we tried to be a real family, not just co-parents sharing a house, what would your expectations be?" Richard joined her at the window. "Total honesty," he replied, "about priorities, fears, expectations, no pretending to be people we're not to please each other." "And what about your work? About the pressures that come with your position?" "My work will always be important to me," Richard admitted, "but it will never again be the only important thing. Gabriel taught me there's a difference between having a successful career and having a successful life." Maria finally turned to face him. "And if I wanted to expand my studio, take on projects in other cities, travel for international presentations?" The question tested whether Richard had truly changed his perspective on independent female careers. "Then we find a way to make it work," Richard answered without hesitation. "Maybe I travel less. Maybe we hire extra help. Maybe Gabriel comes with me on some short trips. We figure it out together." Maria studied him for a long moment, as if searching for signs of falsehood or manipulation. Apparently satisfied with what she saw, she took a small step toward him. "Richard, I don't want to go back to where we were before," she said firmly. "I don't want to try to recreate a relationship that didn't work." "Neither do I," Richard agreed. "I want to create something new, something that's ours, that works for who we are now. With all the complications, with Gabriel, with our careers, with all the baggage we carry." "Especially with all the complications," Richard confirmed, "because the complications are part of who we are. And I love who you've become, Maria. I love your strength, your independence, the incredible mother you are. I love that you don't need me, but you choose to be here anyway." Maria took another step, now close enough for Richard to smell the subtle perfume she wore. "And I love that you finally understand the difference between needing someone and choosing someone." The first kiss they shared in over 5 years was soft, tentative, laden with years of healed hurt and careful hopes. It wasn't the desperate kiss of reunion it might have been months ago, but something more, mature. The acknowledgement that they had consciously chosen to be together. When they parted, Maria rested her forehead against his. "We'll go slow," she said. "For Gabriel, for us. Nothing rushed." "As slow as you want," Richard agreed. "We have time." In the months that followed, they built something neither of them had ever experienced before. A relationship based on conscious choice rather than impulsive passion. There were difficult moments, disagreements over disciplining Gabriel, stress over conflicting schedules, adjustments to the dynamics of a house where three people had their own opinions. But there was also a new solidity, a foundation built on mutual understanding and genuine respect. Gabriel flourished in the stable family environment. His grades at school improved, he became more socially confident, and he developed a sense of security that came from knowing both his mother and father would be there when he needed them. He started calling the house our house with total naturalness, and Richard and Maria, my parents, when talking to other people. A year after the party that had changed everything, Richard and Maria were married in a small ceremony in their backyard, with Gabriel as the proud ring bearer. It wasn't the spectacular wedding Richard had planned with Brooke, nor the romantic celebration of Maria's teenage dreams. It was something better, a ceremony that honestly represented who they were and what they had built together. During the reception, as he watched Maria dance with Gabriel, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them there. He had lost 5 years of his son's life, had almost lost the chance to build a real family, had nearly squandered the opportunity to love and be loved without power games or manipulation. But maybe, he thought, the timing had been perfect. Maybe they needed those years apart to become the people capable of building something lasting. Maybe Gabriel needed those 5 years with Maria to become the secure, loving child who had brought his parents back together, not through drama or manipulation, but simply by being himself. When Gabriel ran to him asking to dance, Richard lifted him into his arms and began to spin around the garden. In the background, he could see Maria laughing, and beyond her, their families and friends celebrating not just a wedding, but the beginning of something that had been built on solid foundations of honesty, respect, and mature love. That night, after the guests had left and Gabriel had fallen asleep, exhausted but happy, Richard and Maria sat in the garden under the stars. The lights of New York City twinkled in the distance, but here, in their small piece of the world, there was peace. "No regrets?" Maria asked, resting her head on his shoulder. "None," Richard answered, kissing her hair. "Only gratitude." "For what?" "For Gabriel. For you. For second chances." Richard paused, thinking. "For learning that real life doesn't happen at grand parties or in glass offices. It happens in kitchens, in kids' bedrooms, in small backyards, with flowers planted by 4-year-old hands." Maria smiled in the dark. Who would have thought a scene in the middle of a party would be the start of real life? "The best scene of my life," Richard agreed. And as they sat there, planning the future while quietly celebrating the present, Gabriel slept peacefully in his room, secure in the knowledge that when he woke up the next morning, his parents would be there, together, finally, completely, and forever together.